I wasn't sure what I was expecting when I booked the Airbnb in that remote town. The description seemed promising. Old mining town, quiet, secluded, ideal for a retreat, and I needed the quiet. I had been stressed out lately, juggling work, family obligations, and a general sense of burnout. This seemed like the perfect escape. A few days alone, with nothing but the sound of wind and the occasional chirp of birds. When I arrived, it didn't look like much, just a dirt road winding through a vast, empty stretch of land. The sign for the town was faded and half buried in the dirt, as though it hadn't been maintained in years. The air was dry, the kind that made your throat scratchy, and the place had a strange, almost desolate feel to it. The buildings were mostly abandoned. Some had windows broken, others had peeling paint and sagging roofs. The few houses that were still standing looked like they hadn't been lived in for decades. A few old vehicles sat rusting on the sides of the roads, their tires flat, their windows shattered. I didn't expect a bustling metropolis, but this felt more like a ghost town, literally and figuratively. But I shrugged it off. I was here to get away, and I wasn't going to let the eerie emptiness get to me. After all, it was just a place. People had lived here once, probably. I figured the real reason I hadn't heard much about it was because it was just out of the way. The Airbnb I rented was one of the only houses still standing. It was an old wooden structure, 2 stories, with a wide porch and a dilapidated garden. The listing had warned me that the place was rustic, but this felt a little beyond that. The steps creaked as I climbed them to the front door, which was barely hanging on its hinges. Inside, the place smelled faintly of old wood and dust, with a layer of grime on every surface. The furniture was mismatched, like someone had pieced it together from different places. A sofa that looked as though it had been there since the 70s, a dining table with chipped legs, and a few armchairs with fabric so worn down it was almost threadbare. The host had left a handwritten note on the kitchen counter welcoming me. It was brief, just a couple of lines about how I could help myself to whatever was in the fridge and a reminder to lock up when I left. There was a map of the town with a few highlighted spots, though it didn't seem like there were many places to visit. The closest gas station was about 20 miles away, and there was a mention of a hiking trail that supposedly led out to some old mining sites if I felt like exploring. I unpacked, started a small fire in the fireplace, and settled in. The silence was almost deafening. The wind outside howled against the walls, and I could hear the occasional creak of the house settling, but otherwise, there was nothing. It was as if the world outside didn't exist. I wasn't used to it, but I figured I would get used to the quiet soon enough. The first evening passed without incident. I went to bed early, just to enjoy the stillness, and fell asleep almost immediately. But that night, something strange happened. I woke up around 3 a.m., startled by a sudden, sharp sound. It was like a scraping noise, something dragging along the floorboards. At first, I thought I was just imagining it. I'd been in strange, isolated places before, and sometimes the mind plays tricks. But the noise came again, louder this time, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being dragged across the room. I lay there, stiff, listening. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. There were no animals here, or at least none that I could think of. I hadn't seen any tracks outside, and I wasn't sure what kind of animal could make that kind of sound. I told myself it was probably just the house settling, some natural creak or shift in the old wood. But then it came again, closer this time, right outside the bedroom door. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The noise stopped. Complete silence followed, thick and oppressive. I waited for what felt like an eternity, and then the noise came again, but this time it wasn't a dragging sound. It was like a thud, like something heavy being dropped. My heart pounded in my chest. I had to get up. I had to see what it was. Slowly, as quietly as I could, I reached for my phone on the nightstand, using its dim light to guide me. I moved toward the door, my steps almost inaudible on the creaky floor. I opened it cautiously and stepped into the hallway. Nothing. The house was dark, the shadows stretching long in the faint moonlight that filtered through the dusty windows. I tried to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. It's probably just an animal, I thought, but something in my gut told me otherwise. I crept down the hallway, each step making the floorboards creak beneath me, and pushed open the door to the living room. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Nothing had changed. The furniture was where I'd left it, undisturbed. But the floor, there was a faint mark in the dust, a trail. Something had definitely been dragged across the room. It started near the back door, and there were small, indistinct impressions in the dust, as if something had been moved along the floor. But the strangest thing, the trail didn't lead anywhere. It just stopped, mid-room. My mind raced. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was just the odd way the dust settled, creating a false impression of movement. I tried to rationalize it, but the unease wouldn't leave. I decided I needed to go back to bed, but I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. I kept hearing little noises, scratches, thuds, the creaking of wood, but every time I got up to check, there was nothing there. The next day, I tried to shake off the weird feeling. I went for a walk around the town to clear my head. There wasn't much to see, just old, decaying buildings and rusted machinery. I passed a few houses that were still standing, but there were no signs of life. No animals, no other visitors, just silence. I stopped in front of the old general store, which was boarded up with wood. There was a faint, chalky sign on the door that read "Closed." I ran my fingers over the boards, feeling the splintered wood, the jagged edges. There was a thick layer of dust on everything, but something caught my eye. Just inside the cracked window, I saw something move. It was quick, just a flash of shadow, but it was enough to make my pulse spike. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. It's just the light, I told myself. It's nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. That night, the sounds came again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The thuds and scraping grew louder, more deliberate. I heard footsteps moving across the floor, but they weren't mine. They were slow, measured, like someone taking their time, like they knew I was listening. I was done. I packed up my things quickly, my hands shaking. I didn't even bother to turn off the lights or lock the door. I grabbed my phone and called the host. The call went straight to voicemail. Of course it did. I wasn't surprised anymore. I left the house, not caring about the cost of the stay or any inconvenience. I drove for miles, not even bothering to look back. When I finally reached the nearest town, I checked into a small motel. The bed was lumpy, the sheets rough, but it was better than the house I just fled. The next morning, I made a few calls, trying to get more information about the place. I found out the town had been abandoned years ago after the mining operations had closed down. There was no mention of anything supernatural or strange, just that it was a forgotten relic of a bygone era. But the strangest thing, when I checked out of the motel, I asked the owner if he knew anything about the Airbnb I'd stayed at. He looked at me with a strange expression before saying, "That old house? People don't usually stay there. No one ever really goes back to that part of town." I asked him why. He hesitated before answering, "There's something about the place. People get uncomfortable there. I don't know. Just don't go back." I didn't. I never went back. I had spent hours searching for a place to stay. I'd been driving for what felt like forever, bouncing between towns looking for something affordable, somewhere I could crash for the night. Most places were booked up. It was late, getting close to midnight, and I had no other option but to settle for a last-minute Airbnb reservation. The description seemed fine, a pleasant spare guest room in an owner-occupied house. The owner, named Craig, said he lived just a few miles away, so it seemed like a decent, safe option. When I arrived, it was dark, the street lit only by the glow of the occasional street lamp. I pulled up to the house, which looked as described, an old but well-kept two-story with a small porch and garden out front. The only problem was that the front door was locked. There was no key, no visible way to get in, just a Wi-Fi-enabled remote lock on the door. I stood there, a little confused, my suitcase in hand, tapping on the door with no response. It wasn't until I checked my phone that I saw Craig's text. "Just use the code I sent you for the front door. Let yourself in." The room is on the 3rd floor. I'm away for the night, but if you need anything, feel free to reach out." So I typed the code into the lock. It buzzed and clicked open. I was a little puzzled, but the relief of finally being inside the house pushed that thought aside. I stepped in, closing the door behind me. I expected to find a typical setup, maybe a hallway with a few rooms and maybe some light music in the background to give the house some life. But it was eerily quiet, too quiet. I glanced around, not sure what I was expecting, but it was unsettling. The house was dark, and the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I fumbled for a light switch but couldn't find one right away. The only light came from some dim lamps in the hallway. I made my way through the house, trying to get a sense of where I was. The first thing that caught my attention was the smell. It wasn't strong, but it was enough to notice the scent of food, like a meal that had been eaten not long ago. As I walked, I passed a dining table. There were dirty dishes piled high, glasses left half empty, and napkins scattered about. The stereo in the living room was still playing soft music, and the sound of it seemed to add to the weird vibe in the house. I had no idea who else might be there. Was Craig home? Was he just being odd with his Airbnb setup? I walked down the hallway to the staircase. A few damp towels were lying on the steps, and they gave off a musty smell, like they'd been forgotten or left out in the rain. My curiosity deepened. Was Craig really living here? I hadn't heard anything from him since the initial text. I continued up the staircase, feeling the strange sensation that I was trespassing in someone else's space. At the top of the stairs, I reached a landing where the hall split and the rooms were on either side. The first door I passed was ajar, and I glanced inside. What I saw froze me. 2 young people, clearly in their 20s, were lying in bed, fast asleep. The door was wide open, and I was standing there, staring at them, unable to look away. They were both naked, tangled in the sheets, completely unaware that I was standing in their doorway. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and a wave of discomfort washed over me. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't trying to be intrusive, but it felt like I was invading their privacy, and there was no way to quietly leave without them noticing. I quickly backed away, my feet almost tripping over each other as I tried to move silently. This was becoming more bizarre by the minute. Remembering the text about my room on the 3rd floor, I hurried upstairs, hoping to find some semblance of order. The 3rd floor hallway was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. It was quiet here too, but the silence was different. This part of the house felt abandoned, almost as if no one had been here in weeks. I found my room, the door unlocked, just as Craig had said it would be. The room itself was small, with a bare mattress on a metal frame, a dusty floor lamp in the corner, and nothing else. There wasn't even a bedside table, and the lamp didn't work. I flicked the switch, but it remained dark. I fumbled around, trying to figure out if maybe there was something wrong with the bulb, but I couldn't make it light. I opened the closet. There was a blanket, some spare linens, but no other furniture or personal touches. Felt sterile, uninviting. Then, I realized something even stranger. There was no bathroom on this floor. Not a single indication that one existed. I checked the text from Craig again. "Bathroom is downstairs," it read. Great. So, if I needed to use the bathroom, I had to go all the way back down to the 1st floor. I wasn't thrilled at the idea, but I could hold it. I lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the odd sense that something was off about the whole situation. But the tiredness from the drive caught up with me, and I eventually fell asleep. The night was long. Every creak of the house made me tense up. I wasn't sure what it was. Maybe the strange atmosphere or the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. Either way, I kept waking up, unsure whether I was dreaming or just paranoid. At one point, I heard the sound of footsteps downstairs, but when I checked my phone, it was already after 2 a.m. No messages from Craig. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was alone in a house that wasn't mine. Morning came too quickly, and when it did, it was an awkward mess. I'd barely gotten any sleep, and I needed to leave. I decided to head downstairs to grab my things. But when I passed the 2nd floor bedroom again, the door was still wide open. This time, I hesitated. The couple was still asleep, but now their nakedness made me feel even more like I was intruding. I quickly gathered my things and made my way out of the house as quietly as I could. I texted Craig to let him know I was leaving early. I didn't want to disturb the couple downstairs, I added, hoping it didn't sound like an accusation, but more like a warning. When I reached the front door, I hesitated before leaving, unsure of whether I should be saying something more. I decided against it and left without another word. But as I walked to my car, I felt a lingering sense of unease. Something didn't sit right. I was certain that the couple downstairs had no idea I had been in the house, let alone standing in their doorway in the middle of the night. I couldn't help but feel that Craig had left me in a situation where I was responsible for my own safety in an unfamiliar house with no supervision. I called Craig later, hoping to clarify what had happened. His response wasn't what I expected. Apparently, he rented out each bedroom to different guests without supervision, didn't check who was staying where, and didn't even bother with locks on the doors for privacy or security. He apologized, but didn't seem to think it was a big deal. He just kept insisting that I had a good stay and didn't understand why I was upset. I spent the next couple of hours trying to get in touch with Airbnb, explaining everything. The lack of security, the fact that I had walked in on strangers in the middle of the night, the broken light and faulty amenities in my room, all of it. After a few phone calls, they finally agreed to issue a refund, but not before a few long, drawn-out arguments. I still couldn't shake the odd, lingering feeling of being unsafe in a place I thought would just be a simple stopover. It wasn't just the broken light or the missing lock on my door. It was the total disregard for privacy, safety, and the feeling that the host was more interested in making money than actually ensuring his guests felt comfortable. Eventually, I was glad I didn't have to deal with the aftermath of my strange night any longer. I couldn't imagine what would have happened if that couple had woken up to find me standing in their doorway, and I couldn't stop thinking about how much worse it could have gotten. I'd gotten lucky, and so had they, but it made me rethink my whole approach to booking places when traveling, and I made a mental note to never trust that everything would be as it seemed. It was a lesson learned the hard way, and I never stayed in another Airbnb again. I booked an Airbnb for a weekend getaway with the idea of getting away from the city, clearing my mind, and just enjoying some peace. It was supposed to be a simple retreat, nothing fancy, just a small cabin in a rural area. I had spent enough time in the hustle and bustle of daily life, and the idea of being surrounded by nature, even for a short while, seemed like the perfect remedy. It looked good online. A cozy cabin, a fireplace, a scenic view, and a large, quiet property. The reviews were decent, and the pictures were all very flattering. A few of them mentioned how serene it was and how much they enjoyed the privacy. I was sold. I didn't think much of it after I booked the place, but as the day of the trip approached, I started to feel a little uneasy. Maybe it was just nerves about being alone in the woods for the weekend, but the thought of spending time in a secluded cabin was starting to mess with my head. Still, I pushed it aside. The drive was long, almost 3 hours, and by the time I arrived at the cabin, it was already late afternoon. The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the trees. The cabin was exactly as it appeared in the photos. Small but charming, with a wraparound porch and a large yard that faded into the woods. The whole place had a quiet, almost eerie calm to it. I had to admit it looked peaceful. As I stepped out of my car and stretched, I noticed how still the air was. There was no breeze, no sounds from animals, not even the rustling of leaves, just silence. The front door was unlocked, as promised in the welcome instructions. I stepped inside and immediately felt an odd chill. It wasn't cold, just a strange, off-putting sensation, like the air was too still, too empty. I brushed it off and explored the house, checking the amenities listed online. The cabin had a full kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace, and a lofted bedroom that overlooked the trees. Everything seemed normal enough, maybe a little outdated, but nothing that would raise any serious red flags. I started to unpack, then took a look around the property. There was a fire pit in the backyard, and the land stretched out for a good distance before the trees began. It was the perfect spot to unwind, and I felt a little better about being there. The sun was setting by this point, and I figured I'd go for a walk before it got too dark. I walked down the gravel path that led to the woods. The air was heavy, and the woods seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my feet crunching on the gravel. I shrugged it off again. Maybe the wildlife was just being unusually quiet. I reached the edge of the trees and stood there for a while, taking in the view. It was beautiful, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the woods didn't feel like they were alive. They felt like they were waiting. After a few moments, I decided to head back to the cabin. That's when I noticed something strange. The window to the living room was wide open. I could have sworn I'd closed it before I left, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe I'd left it open without realizing it. Still, it nagged at me. I went inside, and that's when I noticed something else. There was dust on the kitchen counters, even though the place was supposed to have been cleaned before my arrival. There was a slight smell to the air, too. Not a moldy smell, but something unfamiliar. It was faint, but it was there. I tried to ignore it. I decided to make myself a simple dinner, nothing fancy. The kitchen was functional, but there was something unsettling about it. It looked like it hadn't been used in a while. After I ate, I sat on the couch and watched a movie. The fireplace crackled in the background, providing some warmth, but it did little to ease the feeling of unease that was creeping up on me. I decided to head to bed around midnight. The lofted bedroom was cozy, but there was that same odd stillness to it. I figured it was just the isolation. I turned off the light and tried to sleep, but it wasn't easy. I kept hearing things, small, insignificant noises at first. A creak in the floorboards, a tap against the wall, but it was enough to keep me from relaxing. The longer I lay there, the more I began to question whether I was really alone in that house. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard it. A faint sound coming from downstairs. A thump, then silence. I lay still, listening. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know if it was the house settling or something else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was in the cabin with me. I lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move. Every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified in the silence. I finally got the courage to get out of bed and peek over the railing of the loft to the living room below. The house was dark, but I couldn't see anything unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I grabbed my phone, considering calling someone, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I convinced myself that I was just imagining things and went back to bed. The next morning, I decided to take a walk again to clear my head. I left the house, determined to shake off whatever irrational fears I'd developed. But as I wandered further into the woods, I noticed something strange. Fresh footprints. They looked like they'd been made recently, and they were too big to be mine. The ground was soft in places, so they were clearly recent. I froze. I had checked the area around the cabin before I left for my walk, and there was no sign of anyone having been there. I knew I hadn't seen these prints when I first walked outside, which meant someone had come while I was in the cabin, possibly while I was asleep. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned around and hurried back to the cabin, my mind racing with thoughts of who could be out there. When I returned, I noticed more things. The back door, which I had locked when I left, was slightly ajar. I didn't open it when I went out, so it had been open since my departure. My stomach churned. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was just a neighbor or someone passing by, but the unease settled deeper into my bones. I spent the rest of the day indoors, locking all the doors and windows and trying to stay as busy as possible. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't even reach out to anyone for comfort. The isolation felt oppressive. The silence outside seemed even heavier than before, as if the land was holding its breath, waiting for something. Later that evening, after another long and restless night, I decided I had enough. I packed up my things and went to the car. I didn't care that I hadn't paid for the full weekend or that I'd probably lose my booking fee. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. As I started the car and backed out of the driveway, I took one last look at the cabin. For the first time, I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing by the window on the second floor, just barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't make out any details, but it was enough to send a cold shiver down my spine. I didn't want to stay another minute. When I got back to town, I stopped by a small local diner to grab something to eat. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had followed me from the cabin, but it clung to me like a second skin. I asked the waitress about the cabin, casually mentioning that I'd rented it for the weekend. She looked at me strangely for a moment, then told me that the cabin had been vacant for months before it was listed on Airbnb. She mentioned that some people had stayed there recently, but she hadn't heard of anyone staying for long. I asked her why. She hesitated, then said that there had been some strange reports from past guests about feeling watched or hearing noises in the night, but nothing concrete. Some had even mentioned seeing strange figures in the windows, but no one had ever stayed long enough to figure out what was really going on. I left the diner and felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe I was just paranoid. Maybe it was all in my head, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never rent a place like that again. The silence, the strange occurrences, the feeling that someone, or something, was always lurking just outside the window. I had enough. I didn't sleep well that night, but at least I felt safe. And as I looked back on the whole experience, I couldn't help but wonder. Had someone been there the whole time, or had I just been imagining it all? Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe there was something more to the cabin that I would never understand. Either way, I was done with it. No more AIRBNBs in the middle of nowhere for me. It was supposed to be a nice getaway, a weekend in the mountains, just the family. We'd been looking for a peaceful spot to get away from the everyday grind. A cozy Airbnb nestled in the woods, away from the noise and traffic, sounded like the perfect place. The pictures online showed a charming, rustic house with a big porch, surrounded by trees and mountains in the distance. The reviews were all glowing, nothing seemed off. So we booked it. We arrived around mid-afternoon. The drive was long and winding, with the sun casting a warm golden light through the trees. It was the kind of day that made you feel like you were escaping to a better place. As we pulled up the gravel driveway, the house looked exactly like the pictures. Small, wooden, and old-fashioned, with a chimney poking out the top and a swing on the porch. It was perfect. The air was fresh, and the birds were singing. My mom, dad, and younger brother jumped out of the car, excited to explore the new place. I stayed in the car for a second, just taking it all in. Felt peaceful, too peaceful. The inside of the house was just as cozy as it looked. Old wooden floors creaked underfoot. The scent of pine and something earthy lingered in the air. The living room had a big stone fireplace, a few mismatched chairs, and a bookshelf filled with old books. My mom immediately went for the kitchen. My brother claimed the game room, and I wandered upstairs to check out the bedrooms. There were 3 of them, each decorated in a different style, one with floral patterns, one with a more modern, minimalist touch, and the third with a vintage look. I picked the middle one, the one that looked the most neutral, and threw my bag down. The house was quiet, too quiet. It was one of those types of places where, if you listened hard enough, you could almost hear the silence. The kind of silence that felt like it was pressing in on you. Later, after we settled in, we decided to go for a walk in the woods behind the house. The property had a few acres of land, and the trails looked well kept. It was the kind of walk that felt like an easy, pleasant way to get out in nature without needing to hike for hours. We wandered for about an hour, just talking and laughing, when we came across a small clearing. In the center, there was an old wooden structure, almost like a shed, but it was falling apart. It seemed out of place, like it had been abandoned for years. My mom, being the curious one, wanted to take a look. My dad wasn't too keen on the idea, but he followed anyway. I stayed back a bit, not really wanting to get close. The door to the shed was cracked open, and from where I was standing, I could just barely make out some old tools inside. There were a few rusted gardening implements and a broken chair that had been left behind. I didn't think much of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about it. I didn't know why, but I felt like I wasn't supposed to be there, like the woods were hiding something I wasn't meant to see. We went back to the house, and the rest of the evening went by without incident. We cooked dinner together, played some board games, and sat around the fireplace. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. It was as if the house was watching us. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me, or maybe it was the thought of that shed out in the woods. But I felt like something wasn't right. That night, I stayed in my room, reading a book. I could hear the others talking downstairs, and the occasional creak of the house settling. But around midnight, the sounds stopped. I figured they had all gone to bed. I decided to go downstairs to get some water, but when I stepped into the hallway, I froze. The air felt different, heavy. I could hear something coming from downstairs, but it wasn't the sound of my family. It was a soft shuffling, like someone walking around. My heart raced. I hesitated for a second, then slowly made my way down the stairs. The living room was dark, and the fire had long since died down. But there, sitting in the middle of the room, was a figure. A tall, thin shadow standing completely still. It was hard to make out any details in the darkness, but it didn't look like anyone I recognized. My first thought was that it was someone from outside, maybe someone who had snuck into the house. My pulse quickened, and I slowly backed up a few steps, trying to stay out of sight. But then the figure shifted, slowly. It didn't move toward me. It just turned its head slightly, almost like it was aware I was there. Couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to do. Every part of me wanted to scream, to run back upstairs, but my feet were frozen. The figure just stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then, without making a sound, it stepped into the shadows and disappeared. I didn't wait to figure out what it was. I ran back upstairs, slammed my door shut, and locked it. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. Had I imagined it? Was it just a trick of the light? Or had someone really been in the house? I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. I stayed in my room for the rest of the night, unable to sleep. Every sound, the wind outside, the creaking of the house, the occasional rustle of leaves, made my heart race. I didn't know what was real anymore. In the morning, I debated telling my family, but I didn't want to freak them out. Besides, what could I say? That I saw a shadow in the living room? That wouldn't make any sense. We spent the next day hiking again, trying to put the strange experience behind us. But the further we went, the more uncomfortable I felt. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, especially when we walked near the shed again. It was the same sense of unease, only stronger now, like something was pulling at the back of my mind. That night, after dinner, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, heading toward the shed. My footsteps felt louder than usual as I crossed the yard, and the air around me felt thick with tension. I reached the shed and shone my flashlight through the broken windows. There was something inside, something I couldn't quite make out, but it was large and dark. I pushed open the door, the hinges creaking loudly, and stepped inside. The flashlight beam bounced off old wooden walls, revealing piles of rotting wood and forgotten tools. Then I saw it. At the far corner of the shed was a stack of old boxes, and leaning against them, almost hidden in the shadows, was a piece of old, rusted metal. It looked like it had been left behind, buried and forgotten. I knelt down to take a closer look, brushing away the dirt and debris. When I saw it clearly, my stomach dropped. It was a faded photograph, crumpled and torn, but still visible enough to make out the details. It showed a group of people standing in front of a house that looked exactly like the one we were staying in. Only this house looked different, newer, more alive. The people in the photo were all smiling, standing together like a family. But there was one person who stood off to the side, half in shadow. A tall man with a stern look on his face. I took the photo back to the house, feeling sick to my stomach. My mind raced. Who were these people? Why was their photo hidden in the shed? What had happened here? I showed the photo to my parents, but they just shrugged it off, saying it was probably just some old thing left behind by the previous owners. But I knew it meant something more. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was missing something crucial. We decided to leave the next day. I don't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't meant to be there. As we packed up the car, I took one last look at the house. The The front porch, the windows, the swing swaying in the breeze. It all seemed so normal, so peaceful. But beneath the surface, something was off. Something I couldn't put my finger on. When we drove away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. But as we turned the corner and headed down the winding road, I looked back one last time. The house was still there, standing tall in the woods, silent and still. I don't know if it was the house itself or something that had happened there a long time ago, but I knew one thing: I'd never go back. It was my first time using Airbnb, and to be honest, I was a little nervous. I'd always preferred hotels with their lobbies and front desks, a sense of order to everything. But my friend had convinced me that this place, an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, would be perfect for a weekend getaway. The reviews were glowing, and the pictures looked great. A bit rustic but charming. Plus, it was a good deal. I could never resist a good deal. I pulled up to the property late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The house sat far back from the road, surrounded by trees, with a gravel driveway winding up to the front porch. It looked exactly as described, worn but cozy, a little farmhouse with a wide front porch and lots of windows. The air smelled fresh, like hay and wildflowers, but there was something else in the air too, something earthy. I grabbed my bag, locked the car, and walked up to the front door. The key was hidden under a rock, as the host had promised, and I let myself inside. The inside of the house was just as charming as the outside. The floors creaked beneath my feet, and the old furniture gave the place a cozy, lived-in feel. There was a fireplace in the living room and a soft rug beneath the coffee table. It felt homey, like a place where you could spend a quiet, peaceful evening. But there was something unsettling about the silence, like it was too quiet. I couldn't put my finger on it. After unpacking, I decided to take a walk around the property to stretch my legs. The backyard was overgrown with wild grass and a few scraggly bushes, but beyond that, there was a thick patch of trees. I could hear birds chirping, the faint rustle of leaves, but then I heard something else, a growl, a low, rumbling growl that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned quickly, looking around, but I couldn't see anything. Maybe it was just an animal in the woods. But then I heard it again, a growl closer this time. I froze, my heart pounding. Something wasn't right. I hurried back to the house, glancing over my shoulder as I went, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Once inside, I locked the door and sat on the couch, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. I figured it was just my imagination or maybe a wild animal. There were coyotes in the area, I knew that, but the growl hadn't sounded like any animal I'd heard before. As night settled in, I made myself dinner in the small kitchen, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house was too quiet, too still. I kept hearing noises from outside, like rustling, but every time I looked out the window, all I saw was the darkness of the yard. The wind picked up a bit, making the trees sway, and the house groaned as it settled. I tried to focus on my meal, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I decided to turn in early. The bed in the guest room was comfortable enough, with a soft quilt and plenty of pillows, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing strange noises outside, little scratches at the door, the soft pad of something walking on the porch. It was just the wind, I told myself, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It wasn't the wind. Around midnight, I heard it again. Another growl, low and menacing, from just outside the window. I shot upright in bed, my heart pounding. This was different from the growls I'd heard earlier. This one sounded closer, almost like it was right outside. I crept out of bed and cautiously made my way to the window. I parted the curtains slightly, peering out into the dark yard, but I couldn't see anything. Then, just as I was about to pull back from the window, I saw it. A set of glowing eyes, staring back at me from the edge of the trees. It was too far away for me to make out clearly, but I could see the reflection of its eyes in the dim light. I backed away from the window slowly, my breath shallow. My mind raced. What the hell was that? I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, A deer, maybe, or a raccoon, but deep down I knew it wasn't. It was bigger. It was watching me. I grabbed my phone, thinking about calling the host or even the police, but then I hesitated. What would I say? There was something in the woods, watching me? That wouldn't make any sense. Instead, I turned on the lights in the house, hoping the brightness would keep whatever it was away. The growls came again, this time closer. I heard them, low and throaty, from just outside the house. Something was pacing around the porch. I couldn't bring myself to look out the window again. My mind was racing with possibilities. It had to be a dog, I thought. Maybe someone nearby had a dog, a wild dog, or a stray that had wandered off. That made sense, right? But the sound of the growl grew louder, more intense. It wasn't like any dog I'd ever heard. It sounded different, deeper, more primal. My pulse was hammering in my ears, and I could feel a cold sweat starting to form on the back of my neck. I grabbed the phone again and called the host. It rang several times before she finally answered. Her voice was groggy, like she'd just woken up. "Hello." I could barely speak. My words felt stuck in my throat. "There's something outside," I managed to say. "A dog or something. It's growling, and I don't know what to do." There was a pause on the other end. Then she said, "What do you mean? A dog? Are you sure?" "I'm sure. It's right outside the house, and it's growling." She sighed, like she didn't take me seriously. "It's probably the neighbor's dog. They let it roam sometimes. It's harmless. Just ignore it, okay?" I felt a wave of relief wash over me at her words, but it didn't sit right. The growls didn't sound harmless. They sounded hungry. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "It doesn't feel safe." "You're fine. Just lock the doors and everything will be okay. It's just a dog." I didn't say anything more. I hung up and locked all the windows and doors. I moved around the house, checking everything, making sure I was as safe as I could be. But the growls continued, getting louder. I couldn't focus on anything else. I lay down on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening to the growling and scratching outside. The noises were starting to sound more desperate, like whatever was out there wanted to get in. I heard the door handle jiggle, followed by a snarl. That was it. I couldn't stay here another minute. I grabbed my keys and rushed out the door, locking it behind me. I ran for my car, my legs feeling like jelly as I fumbled with the keys, trying to get inside as quickly as possible. Once I was in, I slammed the door shut, heart racing. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm myself. I took a deep breath, but the growls were still there. I didn't know what it was, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I drove off the property and down the road, not stopping until I found a nearby gas station. I pulled in, got out of the car, and sat on the curb, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next morning, I called the host again, but this time she didn't answer. I left a message, but I didn't expect to hear back from her. I had a feeling she wouldn't be apologizing. I never found out what it was that had been stalking me that night. The growls, the scratching, the eyes in the dark. Everything still felt so real. I didn't want to know the truth, and I didn't need to. I'd left the farmhouse, and I wasn't going back. In the end, I canceled the rest of my stay and got a refund. I didn't want to be in that area again. The place wasn't safe, no matter how nice it looked in the pictures. The next time I booked an Airbnb, I stuck to the city. I didn't care if it was more expensive. At least I knew there were people around. At least I knew I wasn't alone. I've been looking forward to this weekend for months. A quiet cabin in the woods, a secluded spot on the outskirts of town. Just what I needed after a hectic work week. The Airbnb listing had been everything I was looking for. Charming, rustic, with photos that made it look cozy and peaceful. The owner, a man named Derek, had been friendly enough in his messages, answering my questions promptly and giving me directions to the cabin. I'd never stayed in an Airbnb before, but this place seemed perfect. When I arrived, the cabin looked just like the photos. Tucked away in the trees with a small stream running nearby, The wooden structure had an old-fashioned charm. A bit worn, but that just added to its character, in my opinion. I was excited to get settled in, grab a book, and spend the next couple of days relaxing without any distractions. But something felt off almost immediately. I drove up the gravel path that led to the cabin, and there was Derek standing near the porch. He waved as I pulled up, and I waved back, but as I stepped out of my car, I noticed something in his gaze. It wasn't just friendly. It was a little too intense, a little too focused. He was staring at me like he was studying me, which made my stomach tighten uncomfortably. Maybe I was overthinking it. After all, he was just the owner, right? "Hey, welcome," Derek said, his voice warm, almost too warm. "I'll show you around inside." I nodded, a little awkwardly, and followed him inside. The cabin was just as charming as it had looked in the pictures. Wooden beams stretched across the ceiling, and the air smelled faintly of pine and earth. It was cozy, with a large stone fireplace and a couch covered in thick, worn blankets. A large window looked out over the trees, and the light streaming in made everything feel peaceful. He gave me a quick tour, pointing out the essentials like the kitchen, the bathroom, and the bedroom. He mentioned that he had stayed at the cabin the week before to fix up a few things, which made sense since everything looked well maintained. It was odd how he seemed to be lingering in each room a bit longer than necessary, almost as if he was trying to ensure I was impressed. He kept talking about how he'd just remodeled this place and how it had so much character. Finally, we reached the front porch. I was just about to say goodbye, but Derek lingered. "If you need anything, just text me," he said, but his tone was strangely insistent, like he wanted me to know he'd be there. "I'm just down the road." He paused for a second, and I felt my skin crawl. "I live on the property, you know?" "Good to know," I said quickly, trying to hide the discomfort creeping up my neck. Derek gave a little smile, nodded, and left, disappearing down the path toward his house, which I hadn't noticed on the way in. The cabin was isolated, but I realized Derek's house was much closer than I'd thought. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. That night, I settled in, cooked a simple dinner, and spent some time reading by the fire. The cabin was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves outside. I was starting to unwind when I heard a noise. A car approaching, the low rumble of an engine cutting through the silence. I glanced out the window, expecting to see a passing car on the road, but there was nothing. The sound stopped abruptly, and I felt a chill creep down my spine. It was strange, but I dismissed it as nothing more than my imagination. After all, I was alone in a secluded cabin in the woods. The quiet could play tricks on you. As the evening wore on, I started to feel a growing sense of unease. It was hard to pinpoint, but something was off. It wasn't just the sound I'd heard earlier, or the strange intensity in Derek's eyes when he'd shown me around. It was everything. The silence outside. The way the shadows seemed to stretch a little too far. The feeling of being watched, even though I knew no one was around. I decided to shake it off. Maybe I was just tired. I turned off the lights, went to bed, and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. The first night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the cabin. The next morning, I woke up to a message from Derek. It was brief, but it felt like an invasion of privacy. "Hope you're enjoying the cabin. Just wanted to check in. If you need anything, I'm available." I felt a little uneasy, but I didn't think too much of it. I replied, "Thanks, everything's great so far," and tried to move on with my day. But as the hours passed, I kept catching myself looking out the window, half expecting to see Derek standing there, watching me. The thought was irrational, but it wouldn't leave my mind. That afternoon, I went for a walk around the property. I explored the small stream, checked out the edge of the woods, and tried to clear my head. I hadn't gone far when I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt near the stream, big, heavy footprints that looked recent. They weren't mine. I stopped, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. The last thing I wanted was to be paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just an animal, or perhaps I wasn't the only one who liked this secluded spot. but the footprints were too large to be from a deer, and there were no other signs of animals in the area. My mind raced as I started walking back to the cabin, my pace quickening the closer I got. When I got back, I felt a little more on edge than I had before. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows just to be sure. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but something just wasn't right. That evening, after a long day, I was sitting on the porch with a glass of wine when I saw Derek walking down the path toward the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. He didn't seem to be doing anything in particular, just strolling along the path as if it was completely normal. When he saw me, he waved, and I waved back, trying to seem casual. He stopped at the edge of the porch. "How's everything going?" he asked, his voice a little too cheerful. "It's going fine," I said, a bit too quickly, "just enjoying the peace and quiet." "Good, good," he replied. His eyes lingered on me for a moment too long before he nodded and turned to walk back toward his house. That's when I noticed it. There was a car parked outside his place, a car I hadn't seen before. It was a dark, nondescript sedan, parked in the trees at the edge of his driveway. My stomach twisted. Was someone else here, or had Derek been driving that car? I shook it off, telling myself it was just a coincidence, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, I locked every door and window again, just to be safe. I knew I was being paranoid, but the nagging feeling of being watched was getting stronger. The next morning, Derek showed up unannounced, knocking on my door. I opened it, trying to be polite. "Hey, everything okay?" he asked, his voice casual but his gaze a little too intense. "I'm fine, just enjoying the cabin," I said, stepping back, trying to get some space. "Good, good," he said again, nodding as if he were making a mental note of something. "I was just checking in, making sure everything's perfect." He gave me a strange smile before turning and walking away. As he walked back down the path, I watched him go. There was something about the way he moved, too deliberately, too calculated, that made my heart race. It wasn't just the look in his eyes anymore. It was his presence. Felt like he was lingering, watching me. I decided to leave the cabin that afternoon, telling myself I needed a break from the isolation. I drove into town, making sure to keep the car on the main roads. I didn't want to get lost in the woods any more than I had to. When I returned, things felt off. The car from earlier was gone, but there was still a strange heaviness in the air. It was late in the evening by then, and the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the property. I walked inside and immediately felt the familiar sense of unease settle in my chest. I went about my evening routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. I didn't sleep that night. Every little sound made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that Derek was lurking just outside, watching me. It wasn't until the next morning when I found a note slipped under the door that I finally realized the truth. The note was short, but the message hit me like a punch in the stomach. "You didn't lock the back door last night. Be more careful. I'm always nearby." The words were scrawled in sloppy handwriting. My blood ran cold. I hadn't left the back door unlocked, and there was no way he could have known that unless he had been inside. I packed my things and left immediately. I didn't care about the refund or the reviews or the cost of the weekend. I needed to get out, and I needed to do it now. I never contacted Derek again. He didn't respond to the few messages I sent about the strange incidents. To this day, I don't know what his intentions were, but I learned a valuable lesson. Trust your instincts and never ignore that feeling when something doesn't seem right. I'd been hearing a lot of people talking about how quiet and peaceful Airbnb stays in the wilderness could be. So when I stumbled upon a listing for a cabin on the side of a hill deep in a wooded area, it seemed like the perfect getaway. The pictures on the website were stunning. An old, rustic cabin with big windows overlooking a vast, forested valley. The description said it was isolated but easily reachable by a dirt road. They mentioned no neighbors for miles, and the nearest town was about an hour's drive away. I wasn't necessarily looking for an escape from anything, but I figured I could use a weekend of nothing. The reviews were all glowing, with people saying things like, "Great spot to unwind," and perfect place to disconnect. I didn't think too hard about it. I booked the place and drove out there the following weekend. The drive was already more remote than I expected, but I kept going. The roads were narrow, winding through thick trees. The further I went, the more I felt the isolation. At some point, the last sign of civilization faded away. No gas stations, no homes, no cars. Just me, the forest, and the dirt road stretching ahead. I eventually saw the sign for the Airbnb, and the cabin came into view. It was perched on the side of a hill, the wooden structure aged but charming. There was a long driveway that led up to it, surrounded by tall trees that swayed gently in the breeze. The place seemed perfect, exactly what I was hoping for. There was a sense of quiet that I hadn't realized I'd been craving, a silence that swallowed everything. I parked and grabbed my things. The owner had left the key in a lockbox, and I let myself in. The inside was cozy but had a kind of worn, lived-in feel. There was a fireplace in the corner, a big leather couch, and an old wooden dining table. The kitchen had everything I needed, and the bed looked comfortable. It didn't take long to settle in, and soon I was standing on the back porch, sipping my coffee and watching the trees sway. The view was incredible, a stretch of thick forest that seemed to go on forever. The first few hours passed by without incident. I cooked myself a simple dinner, lit the fireplace, and relaxed in the quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling from the trees outside. There was something soothing about the isolation. It wasn't lonely, just peaceful, or so I thought. As night approached, I decided to take a walk. The air was crisp, and the sky was clear, full of stars. I didn't have a flashlight, but there was enough moonlight to see my way. The hill the cabin sat on was steep, so I made my way carefully down the path behind the house, following the trail that wound deeper into the woods. I'd read that the area was known for hiking trails, but I wasn't sure how far they went. I had no plans to go too far. I just wanted a quick walk to stretch my legs. The further I went, the more I felt a sense of something. It wasn't fear exactly, but there was an unease that crept up on me. The trees seemed denser as I walked, and the silence felt thicker. I couldn't hear any wildlife. No crickets, no owls, no wind rustling through the leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the forest floor. That's when I first noticed something odd. I hadn't seen any animal tracks, not a single footprint in the soft earth. That seemed strange to me, but I shrugged it off, convincing myself that animals had probably stayed clear of the path. I kept walking, but the quiet started to feel unsettling, almost unnatural. It wasn't until I turned a corner in the trail that I saw it. A large, rough stone structure, partially covered in moss and vines. At first, I couldn't tell what it was, but as I got closer, I realized it was an old stone well, the kind you'd see in old pictures, long abandoned and forgotten. I stood there for a moment, just staring at it. It wasn't marked on any maps of the area, and it seemed out of place, like it didn't belong in the forest. I walked around the well, peering inside. It was deep, and the inside smelled musty. I couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward it, like something was beckoning me closer. But I stopped myself before I could get too close. There was a chill that ran up my spine, a prickling feeling that made me hesitate. I stood there, looking at the well, until I heard a sound behind me, something shifting in the trees. I turned, but there was nothing. No animals, no rustling, just the same stillness. I quickly made my way back up the trail, feeling a sense of urgency I hadn't felt before. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sky was completely dark. The warmth from the fire welcomed me, and I felt a wave of relief when I stepped inside. But something had changed. The cabin felt different now, the walls seemed closer, the air heavier. I tried to shake it off. I made myself a drink and sat down by the fire, hoping to relax. But I couldn't. The silence was deafening. The longer I sat there, the more it felt like the cabin was watching me. I'd hear faint creaks from the floorboards, like someone was walking around upstairs. But when I checked, nothing was there. I tried to ignore it, but it wasn't easy. I had that feeling, the kind you get when you're being watched, when the hair on the back of your neck stands up. And then a loud bang came from upstairs. a heavy thud that rattled the walls. I jumped up, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to think. I crept up the stairs, my feet barely making a sound on the wooden steps. When I reached the top, I stood there for a moment, listening. The thud had stopped, but there was still a strange noise, like something dragging across the floor. Slowly, I pushed open the door to the bedroom. Empty. Nothing was out of place, but the noise kept going. It sounded like it was coming from the attic, a creaking, scratching sound. I stood there for a long moment trying to decide whether to check it out, but I didn't. I didn't want to go into that attic. Instead, I grabbed my phone and called the owner, just to check in. I didn't get an answer, but the voicemail picked up immediately. "Hey, just wanted to let you know everything's fine," I said, trying to sound calm. But I wasn't. I was already packing my things, mentally making the decision to leave. I didn't know what it was, but something felt wrong. By the time I finished packing, the night seemed even darker. I grabbed my keys, locked up the cabin, and hurried down the hill to my car. The dirt road was even quieter than before, and I felt the eerie silence pressing in on me as I drove away. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights or something moving behind me, but there was nothing, just the empty road stretching out ahead. I made it to the nearest town in about an hour, and I stopped at a small gas station to refuel. As I was filling up, the attendant asked where I'd been. I told him about the cabin up on the hill. His face went pale. "People don't stay up there," he said, his voice low. "There's a reason it's so cheap." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. The next morning, I was sitting at a cafe, nursing a cup of coffee, when I decided to look up the cabin online. Maybe it was just my imagination, but the whole experience had felt off. When I checked the listing, something caught my eye. A small note had been added in the description. "For safety reasons, the attic is off limits to guests." I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of everything. It was a small detail, but it was there. The kind of detail I would have missed if I hadn't gone back to look. I never did go back to that cabin, and I never will. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't need to. The silence on that hillside told me all I needed to know. I had never been the type to get paranoid about booking accommodations online. I was always pretty confident in my decision-making, especially when it came to choosing Airbnbs. The reviews were always glowing, the photos were professional, and the descriptions painted a perfect picture. But looking back, I realize now that maybe I should have paid more attention to that gut feeling that nagged at me when I first saw the listing. It started like any other trip. My partner and I had decided to take a quick getaway to the mountains, a little weekend retreat to escape the noise of the city. We found this quaint little cabin on Airbnb, tucked away in a remote part of the woods. It was described as a peaceful, rustic hideaway with a hot tub and a fireplace. The pictures showed a cozy, well-maintained interior, complete with soft lighting and wooden beams. It seemed like the perfect place to unwind, and the price wasn't bad either. The listing had no reviews, which, in hindsight, should have been a red flag. But I convinced myself it was a brand new listing, and I figured we were probably among the first to book it. The host seemed nice enough in their messages, always quick to reply and offering helpful tips about the area. They even sent a welcome message a few days before we arrived, reminding us to relax and enjoy the quiet. We drove up to the cabin on a Friday evening, the sun dipping behind the trees as we navigated the winding roads that led deeper into the forest. The GPS kept trying to reroute us, and I started to wonder if maybe the place wasn't as easy to find as it had seemed on the map. But eventually, we turned down a narrow, unpaved road that led us to the cabin. It was tucked behind a line of thick trees, barely visible from the road. At first glance, it looked fine. The cabin was a small, wooden structure, surrounded by tall pines and the sound of a distant stream. It had a rustic charm to it, with an old-fashioned porch swing and a stack of firewood by the door. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of mountain air that feels clean and fresh. It was everything I had hoped for in a quiet retreat. I took out the key that had been left for us under the welcome mat and unlocked the door. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell. Musty, like old wood and dampness. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't what I expected. The place was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from a few lamps and the fading glow from the windows. The furniture was older than I expected, with cushions that looked like they hadn't been replaced in years. The walls were adorned with a few strange paintings, but they weren't anything I'd call appealing. I remember thinking they looked out of place, almost too weird for a cabin, but I brushed it off. The place was private, and we were here to get away from the world. We settled in, unpacking our things and getting the fire started in the hearth. The place was a little colder than we'd anticipated, but it wasn't unbearable. The heater kicked on soon enough, and we didn't think much of it. We spent the evening relaxing, cooking a simple dinner, and watching a movie on the small TV. It wasn't the luxury getaway I'd imagined, but it had a certain charm to it, until it didn't. Around midnight, I decided to step outside for a moment. The air had grown chilly, and the sky was clear, dotted with stars. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something strange in the woods. It was a figure moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something else common in the area. But the figure didn't seem right. It was too tall and too thin, its movements jerky, like someone who didn't quite know how to walk. I quickly brushed it off, telling myself I was just tired, maybe imagining things. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me, but the feeling that something wasn't right had started to settle in. I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone in the woods. We went to bed soon after. The bed was old, the mattress soft and uneven, but I managed to fall asleep despite the discomfort. I was just starting to drift off when I heard something. A tapping, soft at first, like someone knocking on the walls of the cabin. It was faint, but it was there. My partner didn't seem to hear it, so I told myself I was just hearing things. But the tapping grew louder, more persistent. It wasn't coming from the walls, it was coming from the window. Someone or something was tapping on the window. My heart started to race. I tried to tell myself it was just a branch brushing against the glass, but it didn't feel like that. The tapping was too deliberate. I didn't want to get up, didn't want to look outside, but I knew I had to. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peer outside. There was nothing, no one. The woods were dark and still, and the only sound was the rustling of the trees in the wind. I was on edge the rest of the night, barely sleeping, waiting for the next tap, the next sound. But it didn't come. The next morning, I told myself it had all been in my head. I had let my imagination get the best of me. My partner, completely unaware of the previous night's events, suggested we go for a hike. We had breakfast, and then we headed out to explore the surrounding area. The forest was beautiful, and for a while, I was able to relax and forget about the weirdness the night before. We spent most of the day hiking, and by the time we got back to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. It was around that time that I noticed something odd. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar. I was sure we had locked it before we left, but now it was open by about an inch. My heart skipped a beat. I told my partner, but they shrugged it off, assuming the wind had pushed it open. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We closed the door, checked the locks, and went inside. That's when things started to get really strange. We noticed that some of our things had been moved. Our bags, which had been neatly packed in the bedroom, were now scattered around the living room. My partner's jacket, which had been on a chair, was now thrown across the floor. It wasn't a mess. It was more like someone had rifled through our stuff, looking for something. My mind raced. There had been no signs of forced entry. The windows were still locked, the door was still intact. But someone had been here. Someone had been inside our cabin while we were gone. I immediately checked the phone, but there was no service, no signal. We were in the middle of nowhere, and no one knew where we were except the host. I tried to stay calm, but every instinct told me to get out of there. My partner, however, was determined to stay the night. They didn't think it was a big deal, just some animals or maybe other guests who had been messing around. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, I hardly slept. I kept hearing noises, scratching at the walls, footsteps on the porch, the same tapping on the windows. It was as if something or someone was trying to get in. But every time I checked, nothing was there. No one was there. By morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I told my partner that we needed to leave, that we couldn't stay another night. They weren't happy, but after some arguing, they agreed. We packed up quickly, but before we left, I decided to check the cabin one last time. I walked through every room, opening every closet, every drawer, just to make sure no one was hiding. That's when I found it. In the closet of the master bedroom, behind a stack of old blankets, there was a small, hidden door. It was barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. I opened it carefully, and inside, there was a small, dusty room. It wasn't big, but it was enough to fit someone. The room was bare, except for a few items: a blanket, a flashlight, and a small box. I opened the box, and inside were old photographs, pictures of the cabin, of the woods, and of people I didn't recognize. There were also a few pieces of clothing, and in the corner, a small, torn-up journal. I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to know what it all meant. I slammed the door shut, grabbed my partner, and we left as fast as we could. We didn't speak much on the way back. I was shaken, but relieved to be leaving. The woods felt so much bigger once we were driving away, like something was still watching us. When we got back to the city, I messaged the host. I told them about the strange occurrences, the things that had been moved, the door that had been left open, and the hidden room. They responded quickly, apologizing for the inconvenience. They explained that the cabin had been in their family for generations, and it had recently been renovated for rentals. They assured me that no one else had been there during our stay. But I knew better. Something about that place didn't feel right, and I wasn't going to be the one to find out what else it was hiding. We never went back. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a weekend getaway to escape the noise and stress of my daily routine. I'd found a small, affordable Airbnb listing in a quiet town just outside the city. The place seemed perfect for a solo retreat. Isolated, cozy, and peaceful. Exactly what I needed. The host was friendly enough, and the reviews, while brief, were positive. There was just one thing that stood out. The listing mentioned a basement in the house, but there was little information beyond that. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just for storage or perhaps a small living area. When I arrived, the house was just as charming as the photos had promised. A typical old house with creaky floors, faded wallpaper, and that kind of dusty, lived-in feel that made it seem more like a home than a commercial property. The kind of place you can imagine being full of life, stories, and memories. The host greeted me warmly, handed me the keys, and explained how things worked, pointing out the front door, the kitchen, and, of course, the basement. "You'll find the basement door just off the kitchen," she said casually, almost as if she were telling me about an extra closet. "It's not locked, but I wouldn't go down there if I were you. It's a little unfinished." I nodded, smiling politely, figuring it was just one of those things you'd find in older houses. Maybe there were some unfinished projects down there, or storage spaces that weren't meant to be used by guests. No big deal. The first night passed without incident. The house was quiet, the kind of silence you can only find when you're in a rural area, far from any busy streets or city lights. The bed was comfortable, and I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that feels like a real escape. When I woke up the next morning, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, enjoying the view of the overgrown garden outside. That's when I noticed the door to the basement, tucked at the back of the kitchen. It was a heavy wooden door, painted a dull gray, with a brass handle that looked a little too old for its age. There were no steps leading to it, just a flat threshold. Curiosity got the best of me. It was almost too tempting, the idea of a mysterious door in an old house like this. Seemed harmless enough, but something about it felt off. Still, I dismissed it. I wasn't one to go poking around in places I wasn't supposed to. After a while, I left the house for the day, exploring the small town and trying to enjoy my time away. But the basement kept creeping back into my thoughts. Every time I passed by the kitchen, I would glance at the door. It was as though something about it was calling me. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was more like an itch I couldn't scratch. I kept imagining what could be down there. Maybe some old furniture or just a dark, musty space full of forgotten things. It didn't seem like anything worth worrying about, but the longer I stayed in the house, the more I felt like I was being drawn toward it. I came back to the house late in the evening, tired from walking around and seeing the sights. The sun had just set, and the house was already beginning to cool down, the quiet of the night settling in. I made dinner, watched a bit of TV, and then, around 9 p.m., I found myself standing in the kitchen again. Without really thinking about it, I reached for the door to the basement. The door was unlocked, just like the host had said. It swung open with a creak, revealing a small, narrow staircase that descended into total darkness. Couldn't see a thing. The air coming from the basement felt cool and damp, like it had been sealed off from the rest of the house for a long time. The step down felt strange, the wood creaking under my weight as I slowly descended, my hand brushing the rough wall. My heart started to beat a little faster. I didn't know why, but I felt a rush of adrenaline, like I was doing something wrong, even though I hadn't planned on going down there. I reached the bottom of the stairs, and the darkness felt thicker. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I fumbled for a light switch, but there was nothing. I hesitated, wondering if I should turn around and just forget about it. But the curiosity was stronger now, pushing me forward. I pulled my phone from my pocket, turning on the flashlight, and the beam cut through the darkness. I stepped further into the basement, and that's when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, there was an old wooden chest. The kind of chest you see in old pirate movies, worn and scratched, with rusted metal corners and a faded leather strap across it. It looked out of place in the otherwise empty room. It didn't make any sense. Why would there be a chest down here? Why hadn't the host mentioned it? I couldn't help myself. I moved closer. As I reached for the chest, I noticed something strange. There were symbols carved into the wood, faint and barely visible under layers of dust. The carvings seemed random at first, but as I looked closer, I realized they formed a pattern. It wasn't a language I recognized, just strange, jagged marks that twisted into each other. I took a step back, feeling suddenly uneasy. The temperature in the basement seemed to drop. I glanced around, but the basement was otherwise empty. The walls were lined with shelves, stacked high with old boxes and forgotten furniture. I shook my head, trying to clear the unease that was slowly growing inside me. I wasn't sure what I was afraid of. Maybe the chest, or maybe the idea of being down here alone, surrounded by things that had been untouched for years. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I quickly made my way back up the stairs, closing the door behind me. I locked it for good measure. When I sat back down in the kitchen, I felt ridiculous. There was nothing wrong. It was just a chest. Old houses have basements like this, full of random, forgotten things. I tried to forget about it for the rest of the evening, but I couldn't stop thinking about the chest and those strange symbols. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling uneasy, but trying to brush off the feeling. I went to grab some breakfast, but as I entered the kitchen, I froze. The basement door was open. I hadn't opened it since the night before. In fact, I was sure I had locked it. But there it was, standing ajar, a faint draft coming from the darkness below. My heart skipped a beat, and I found myself frozen in place, staring at the open door. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Maybe I had forgotten to lock it. Maybe the wind had blown it open. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. I walked over to the door, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the handle. I closed it, locking it again, and backed away from it slowly. I couldn't explain why, but I had to get out of the house. I grabbed my things, packed my bag, and left for the day. I drove around for hours, trying to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. But the thought of the basement kept creeping back into my mind. I didn't want to go back to the house, but I couldn't leave. I was stuck and the house was paid for. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. Maybe I had just imagined the door being unlocked. Maybe I was just tired. But that night, I returned. When I walked back into the house, the first thing I did was check the basement door. It was locked, just like I'd left it, but something felt different. The air in the house felt heavier, as if it were pressing down on me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I spent the evening in the living room, trying to keep myself occupied, but the silence was oppressive. It was like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I finally went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, my thoughts racing. I kept hearing things, small noises, like footsteps upstairs or the creak of floorboards. It wasn't loud enough to be anything definitive, but it was enough to keep me awake, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept thinking about the chest, about the symbols, and about the feeling that something was wrong in that basement. I finally fell into a restless sleep, but I woke up to something that I couldn't ignore. It was a sound coming from the basement. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but it grew louder. There was something moving down there, something that shouldn't have been. I grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight, and crept toward the door. It was unlocked. I don't know what I was expecting, but I knew I had to go down there. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I descended the stairs, the flashlight cutting through the dark like a knife. The basement was still and silent, the only sound the faint hum of the house settling. And then I saw it, the chest. But it wasn't the same as before. The carvings were glowing, faintly but unmistakably. The symbols were pulsating with a light I couldn't explain. The chest was moving ever so slightly, as if something inside it was alive. And that's when I heard the voice. It was quiet at first, like a whisper from far away, but then it grew louder. It wasn't a voice, not really, more like a feeling, a presence. I backed away, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. I had to get out. I ran up the I had always been a fan of road trips, the kind of spontaneous adventure where you don't really plan anything beyond the drive and a general sense of where you want to end up. That's how I ended up booking a last-minute Airbnb for a weekend getaway in a small town about 2 hours outside of the city. I'd heard good things about the place, a secluded little spot, surrounded by woods, and close enough to a lake for some quiet time by the water. Perfect for a weekend away from the daily grind. I booked the place on a whim, choosing a cabin that seemed charming in the pictures. The listing promised a cozy, rustic feel, with a wood-burning stove and plenty of open space. I figured it would be a nice break from the chaos of city life. The instructions seemed clear enough. The Airbnb was tucked away a few miles from town, and the host had mentioned a few landmarks to guide you there. Nothing complicated, right? Just a cabin in the woods. What could go wrong? The drive started out easy. The weather was fine, and the roads were clear. But as I got closer to the town, the GPS started acting weird. It was only a slight inconvenience at first, taking me down smaller roads that weren't even marked on the map. But I shrugged it off, figuring this was just some rural quirk. The further I went, though, the more I started feeling a little uneasy. The sun had started to dip lower in the sky, and the landscape was becoming more isolated. No other cars on the road, just endless stretches of trees and fields. I passed through the small town, which barely had more than a couple of gas stations and a few houses scattered along the main road. It wasn't exactly what I'd call bustling. My GPS said I was only a few minutes away from the Airbnb, but after about 5 minutes, the road started to look less and less familiar. There were no signs, no street lights, just the endless stretch of dirt roads and thick woods on either side. I slowed down, trying to read the directions again, but my phone had no signal. The map had frozen, and there was no way to double-check the address. I figured I was close enough that I could find it just by looking for the right landmarks. That's when I realized something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but it was the kind of feeling you get when you know something's not right, even if you can't explain it. The road seemed to get narrower and more overgrown, with branches brushing against my car as I drove. I kept thinking about the instructions from the host. Once you pass the old barn on your left, take the next right, they said. Simple enough, except I hadn't seen any barn. not one that looked like it belonged on this road. Anyway, I turned onto another dirt road and drove for what felt like forever. The trees were so thick around me now that the light was almost gone. I rolled down the window, trying to hear if any other cars were nearby, but all I could hear was the rustling of leaves in the wind. No signs of life. The road didn't seem to go anywhere. No houses, no cabins, nothing but more trees. At this point, I was starting to panic a little. I stopped the car and pulled over. I figured I'd try to backtrack and find the last turn I missed. But the road behind me looked just as confusing as the one in front. I checked the time. Sunset was in full swing, and I hadn't seen any signs of the cabin yet. I was supposed to be at the Airbnb by now, but it felt like I was nowhere near it. I took a deep breath and decided to keep going. Maybe I had missed the barn, or maybe the cabin was just hidden farther down. I turned the key in the ignition and drove a bit further. I started scanning the woods on both sides, hoping for some kind of clue. That's when I saw it. Pair of headlights. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but sure enough, a set of lights appeared in the distance, coming toward me. A car. Relief flooded through me. Maybe I could ask for directions. Maybe they were heading to the same place. I slowed down to let them pass. But as the car got closer, something felt wrong. The headlights weren't the soft, yellowish glow of a normal car. They were bright white, almost blinding. And the car itself seemed oddly out of place. Too modern, too polished. It didn't seem like something that would fit on these back roads. My heart started to race. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random traveler. The car passed by me without slowing down, and I couldn't even make out a silhouette of the driver. The headlights disappeared into the distance, leaving me in a sudden darkness. The stillness of the night felt too heavy. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I tried to shake it off. There were probably just a few other people staying out here for the weekend, and I had no reason to assume anything strange was going on. I drove on for another 20 minutes, but still no sign of the cabin. The road began to get rougher, and the trees seemed to close in even more. The sun was gone now, and the darkness was complete. There was no way I could turn back at this point. I needed to find the place before I ran out of daylight entirely. Then, just as I was starting to feel totally lost, I saw something. A faint glow in the distance, through the trees. It was dim, but it was definitely light. A porch light, maybe? I pushed the gas pedal a little harder, desperate for confirmation that I had finally found the right place. The light got brighter as I approached, and soon enough, I could see the cabin through the trees. My heart skipped a beat with relief. It was the right place. A small, rustic cabin with warm light spilling out of the windows. It looked exactly like the picture in the listing. I parked the car and took a deep breath, ready to stretch my legs and relax after the stressful drive. But as I stepped out of the car, I noticed something strange. The air was so still, and I could hear nothing. Not a single bird chirped. No wind. Not even the usual sounds of animals in the night. Just silence. I couldn't explain why, but it felt like something was off. Still, I shook it off. I was finally here. I grabbed my bag and walked up to the door, but just as I was about to knock, I saw something that made my stomach twist. The porch light, which had been glowing warmly just moments before, flickered out. I froze. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I was imagining things. Maybe it was just a light bulb or some electrical issue. But as I stood there, I heard movement coming from inside the cabin. It wasn't just a creak of old wood, but something much heavier. The sound of footsteps, someone walking around. I stepped back, unsure what to do. I'd been given the code to the lockbox, so the place should have been empty. And yet, here I was, standing on the porch of a cabin that seemed to be occupied. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. The footsteps stopped. I didn't know what to do. I was out here in the middle of nowhere with no other options. Should I go back to the car and leave? Or should I wait and see if the person inside opened the door? I decided to try the lockbox code. Maybe the host was just inside, not hearing me knock. I entered the code, and the box clicked open. But as I pulled out the key, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from behind that cabin door. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I forced myself to move forward, stepping inside the cabin and closing the door behind me. Once I was inside, I couldn't believe how quiet it was. The cabin was exactly what I had imagined. Charming, warm, and inviting, but the air felt too thick, too still. I set my bag down by the door and took a few steps further inside. Then something caught my eye. There, on the small kitchen table, was a note, a crumpled piece of paper, written in handwriting that wasn't the host's. I unfolded it and read the words, feeling my blood run cold. "Get out. You shouldn't be here." I froze. The letter wasn't signed, and there were no other details. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but my instinct was clear. I wasn't supposed to be here. I turned and grabbed my bag, ready to leave. Just then, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. The cabin was empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I realized I needed to get out. Now, I bolted for the door, not bothering to grab my phone or anything else. I slammed it open and ran to my car, starting the engine without a second thought. The headlights illuminated the woods around me as I backed up, turning the car around as quickly as I could. As I sped down the road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road was empty. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway again, my heart still racing. I didn't look back. I ended up driving to a nearby town and staying in a motel for the night. I didn't sleep much, still rattled by the feeling of being watched and the strange note I had found. The next day, I got in touch with the host, explaining what happened. They were shocked to hear about my experience and assured me no one else had been booked for that weekend. They promised to investigate the issue further, but honestly, I wasn't waiting around for them to figure it out. I left a review on the listing, telling the truth about what happened, hoping that no one else would end up in that same situation. I still don't know what exactly happened out there, but I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly avoided something far worse. Sometimes, when I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A solo getaway to a charming Airbnb nestled in the heart of a quaint town. The listing showcased a cozy, well-lit apartment with modern amenities and glowing reviews. It seemed like the perfect retreat to unwind and recharge. Upon arrival, the neighborhood exuded a serene ambience. Tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, and the distant aroma of freshly baked bread from a nearby bakery set a welcoming tone. The exterior of the building matched the photos. A picturesque facade with ivy creeping up the walls, hinting at the charm within. Entering the apartment, I was greeted by a tastefully decorated living space. Sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating the hardwood floors and eclectic furnishings. A plush sofa invited relaxation, and a small bookshelf boasted an array of novels and travel guides. The kitchen, though compact, was equipped with modern appliances and stocked with essentials. Everything appeared immaculate. After unpacking, I decided to freshen up. The bathroom was spotless, with fluffy towels neatly arranged and a selection of toiletries provided. The attention to detail reassured me that I had made the right choice in accommodations. As evening approached, I prepared a light dinner, enjoying the tranquility of the space. The bed, adorned with crisp linens and an assortment of pillows, promised a restful night's sleep. Exhausted from the day's travel, I settled in, allowing the gentle hum of the ceiling fan to lull me into slumber. In the middle of the night, I awoke to a faint itching sensation on my arm. Groggily, I dismissed it as a minor irritation and drifted back to sleep. By morning, the itching had intensified, and upon inspection, I noticed a series of small, red welts trailing along my forearm. Concerned, I attributed them to possible mosquito bites acquired during my evening stroll and resolved to purchase some anti-itch cream later that day. The day unfolded pleasantly. I explored the town's charming boutiques, sampled local delicacies, and immersed myself in the vibrant culture. Returning to the apartment in the early evening, I felt a renewed sense of contentment. The space felt like a home away from home. That night, however, the itching became unbearable. I tossed and turned, unable to find relief. In the dim glow of the bedside lamp, I noticed additional bites appearing on my legs and torso. A creeping unease settled over me. Determined to identify the cause, I meticulously examined the bed. Pulling back the sheets, I scrutinized the mattress seams and folds. My heart sank as I spotted tiny, rust-colored stains and, to my horror, a small, flat insect scurrying away from the light. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Bed bugs. Panic set in. I had heard of the nightmares associated with bed bug infestations, the relentless itching, the difficulty of eradication, and the potential of bringing them home. My mind raced with questions. How long had they been here? Had previous guests encountered the same issue? Most pressingly, what should I do next? I immediately contacted the host through the Airbnb app, detailing my discovery and expressing my concerns. Hours passed without a response. Feeling helpless, I reached out to Airbnb's customer support. After navigating through automated responses, I finally connected with a representative who listened to my predicament. The representative expressed sympathy and assured me that they would investigate the matter. In the meantime, they suggested I find alternative accommodations and promised to assist with the process. Grateful for the support, I hastily packed my belongings, taking care to inspect and isolate items to prevent potential contamination. Securing a last-minute hotel room proved challenging, but I eventually found a vacancy in a nearby establishment. The stark contrast between the pristine hotel room and the infested apartment was palpable. I spent the night laundering my clothes, inspecting my luggage, and researching bed bug protocols to ensure I hadn't inadvertently transported any unwelcome guests. The following day, Airbnb informed me that they had contacted the host, who denied any knowledge of an infestation. The host suggested that I might have brought the bed bugs with me, a claim that left me feeling both insulted and frustrated. I knew this wasn't the case. I had taken every precaution during my travels. Airbnb offered a partial refund for the nights I hadn't stayed and provided a credit toward future bookings. While the gesture was appreciated, it didn't fully compensate for the distress and inconvenience I had experienced. Moreover, the thought of other unsuspecting guests potentially facing the same ordeal troubled me. Determined to prevent others from enduring a similar situation, I left an honest and detailed review on the listing, describing my experience and urging the host to address the issue promptly. To my dismay, the review was removed shortly after posting, leaving me questioning the transparency of the platform's review system. In the weeks that followed, I remained vigilant, monitoring my belongings and living space for any signs of infestation. Thankfully, it appeared that my efforts to contain the situation had been successful. However, the psychological toll lingered. The mere thought of bed bugs evoked a visceral reaction, and the experience left a lasting imprint on my perception of short-term rentals. This ordeal underscored the importance of thorough research and vigilance when choosing accommodations. While platforms like Airbnb offer unique and personalized lodging options, they also come with inherent risks. It's crucial for both hosts and guests to maintain open communication, uphold cleanliness standards, and address issues promptly to ensure a safe and comfortable experience for all parties involved. In the end, the trip that was meant to be a rejuvenating escape became a cautionary tale, one that serves as a reminder to always inspect your surroundings, trust your instincts, and advocate for your well-being, no matter the circumstances. I had been planning this solo trip for months. It was supposed to be a chance to clear my head, disconnect from the noise of my usual life, and recharge in nature. After scrolling through countless Airbnb listings, I came across a charming cottage in a small, secluded village. The photos showed a rustic stone house surrounded by greenery, with a beautiful garden and cozy interiors. The reviews, though sparse, were positive and the price was right, cheap enough to make it feel like a hidden gem. I was sold. Without overthinking it, I booked the place for a week. The day of the trip arrived, and I was more than ready to escape. I packed my bags, threw my things in the car, and set out on the road. The drive was long and winding, taking me through quiet country roads. The further I went, the less civilization I saw. By the time I reached the village, It felt like I was stepping into another world, a slower-paced, more peaceful one. The air smelled fresh, the trees were thick with green, and the roads seemed deserted. It felt like I had driven into a forgotten corner of the world, a place untouched by the hustle and bustle of modern life. Following the GPS directions, I wound my way down a narrow, overgrown lane. The trees hung low, their branches almost touching the roof of my car, casting long, dark shadows across the road. As I rounded a bend, I saw the cottage up ahead. It was exactly as it had looked in the photos, except for one thing: it seemed older. The stone walls were weathered, and vines crept up the sides of the house, adding to the rustic, almost eerie feeling of the place. The roof sagged slightly, and there were signs of age, but nothing that seemed too alarming. I parked my car and took a deep breath, feeling a mix of excitement and unease. As I got out, an old man appeared from the front door. He was tall, with a gaunt frame, and his face was lined with deep wrinkles. His hair was white and thin, and his eyes, blue piercing, seemed to look right through me. He wore a tattered cardigan over a stained shirt and faded trousers. There was something unsettling about him, but I tried to brush it off. "You must be the guest," the man said in a raspy voice, extending a hand. "I'm Harold. Welcome." I shook his hand. It felt cold and clammy, like a dead fish. "Nice to meet you," I replied, a little taken aback by the strange energy in his greeting. "Come on in," Harold said, stepping aside to let me through the door. "I'll show you around." The interior of the cottage was just as old as the outside. The walls were lined with faded floral wallpaper, peeling in some spots. The furniture was mismatched and worn. There was a fireplace in the living room, and the scent of old wood and must filled the air. The place had a heavy atmosphere, like it hadn't been touched in years. In the corner of the room stood an enormous grandfather clock, its ticking echoing through the silence. "Here's the living room," Harold muttered, walking ahead. "The kitchen's through there. Upstairs is the bedroom. The bathroom is at the end of the hall." I followed him, trying to ignore the odd, uncomfortable feeling creeping over me. As we passed through the rooms, I couldn't help but notice that the place seemed to be frozen in time. It was as if nothing had been updated in decades. The furniture was old, but not in a charming, antique way, more like it had been left behind and forgotten. "Everything you'll need is here," Harold continued, his voice flat. "But there are a few rules." I turned to him, eyebrows raised. "Rules?" Harold's expression darkened slightly. "Yes, a few things to keep in mind. First, don't go into the basement. It's off limits. Second, keep the curtains drawn after dark. And third, if you hear noises at night, don't pay them any mind. Just ignore them." I froze. "What kind of noises?" He just stared at me, his eyes never blinking. "The wind plays tricks here," he said, his voice cold. "Best not to worry about it." I forced a smile, though unease had settled heavily in my chest. "Got it," I said, though the warning didn't sit right with me. Harold handed me a key, an old, rusted thing that seemed to belong to another era. "Lock the doors at all times," he instructed. "It's a safe village, but you can never be too careful." "Thanks," I said, feeling even more unsettled. With that, he walked out, leaving me standing alone in the living room. I locked the door behind him, though I wasn't sure why. The place felt strangely suffocating, like the walls were closing in around me. I wandered around for a while, unpacking my things and getting familiar with the house. The kitchen was stocked with basic supplies, enough for a few meals, but everything was expired or half-used. The bedroom was small, the bed lumpy, the blankets faded and threadbare. It smelled of dust and mildew. I pulled back the curtains, revealing a dense forest just beyond the yard. The trees were thick, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. It was beautiful in a way, but also oppressive, like the woods were watching me. That night, I tried to relax. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, its rhythmic sound filling the silence of the house. I sat by the fire, reading, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was too quiet, and every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo loudly in the stillness. I turned off the lights and made my way upstairs to bed. It wasn't long before I heard it, the soft shuffle of footsteps downstairs. I froze, straining to listen. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too intentional. I grabbed my phone, checking the time. It was after midnight. I waited, listening in the darkness, my heart racing. The footsteps continued, slow and heavy, like someone was walking around in the kitchen. I considered calling the police, but something held me back. The house was so isolated, so far from the nearest town, that I would have no idea how to explain this situation. It was probably nothing. I had to remind myself that Harold had warned me about the wind. Maybe it was just the house creaking, or maybe the old man had been up to something. Despite my racing thoughts, I eventually managed to fall asleep, but my rest was restless. I woke up several times throughout the night to the sound of the grandfather clock ticking and a strange, distant thudding noise coming from somewhere in the house. Each time, I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area to distract myself. I spent the afternoon walking through the village, but it was eerily quiet. The people I passed greeted me, but there was an odd distance in their eyes. No one wanted to talk, and every conversation seemed to end abruptly. I felt like an outsider, like I was being watched. By the time I returned to the cottage, the sun was starting to set, and I felt a nagging sense of unease deep in my gut. As night fell, I did my best to ignore the feeling and settled in for another quiet evening. The wind howled outside, and the trees creaked under its pressure. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time they were heavier, closer. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed the old key Harold had given me and quietly made my way down to the basement door. I don't know what drove me to it, but curiosity got the better of me. The door was locked, but the key fit perfectly. I opened it, and a musty, damp smell hit me immediately. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness. The basement was full of old furniture. Chairs, tables, shelves of dusty books, and strange trinkets. But what caught my eye was the far corner, where several mannequins were lined up. They were dressed in tattered clothes, their heads and limbs missing, standing there like silent sentinels. As I moved closer, I noticed something disturbing. Some of them wore clothes that looked identical to the ones in the old photographs I had seen upstairs. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something was wrong here. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mannequins. That's when I saw it. One of the mannequins wore a dress that looked eerily similar to one my grandmother used to wear. A feeling of dread washed over me as I took a step back, my mind racing. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking above me. Panic surged through me. I turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. As I reached the top, I froze. The living room door was wide open, and I was sure I had locked it when I came downstairs. I rushed to the door, heart pounding, but no one was there. The house was silent again, except for the ticking of the clock. I locked the door and checked all the windows. Everything was secure, but the unease wouldn't go away. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew I needed to get out. That night, I packed my things in a hurry. I didn't care about leaving in the middle of the night. I just needed to get away from that house. As I grabbed my bags and walked, I had always looked forward to our vacation in Florida. It had been a while since my partner and I had been able to take some time off, and we were both in desperate need of a break. Florida was always on our radar: sunny weather, beaches, and an easygoing vibe. We thought it would be a good opportunity to try out an Airbnb, something a little more personal than a hotel, with the promise of a cozy and unique space. We found a listing online that seemed perfect for us. It was an affordable, self-contained apartment in a quiet area, and it boasted high ratings with glowing reviews from other guests. We were sold. The pictures showed a charming little space with a bright kitchen and a comfortable living area. The host had multiple properties listed, which we took as a good sign, figuring they were experienced in managing short-term rentals. We booked it and counted down the days until we could escape the stress of work. When we arrived at the Airbnb, it was a warm evening in Florida. The apartment looked decent enough, though a little more lived in than expected. The place had the slightly worn feel of a rental, with some scuff marks on the walls and an old fridge that hummed too loudly. It wasn't anything that would make you run out the door, though, and we figured we'd settle in quickly. We spent the first few hours relaxing, unpacking our bags, and enjoying the space. The kitchen looked perfectly usable, and the living room had a small couch and a TV, just the right size for a quiet evening in. The bed was a bit firm for my liking, but overall, the apartment was fine, nothing special, but not awful either. That night, after a long day of travel, we were both tired. We decided to get a good night's sleep before starting our vacation in full the next morning. I went to bed early, but around midnight, I woke up. It wasn't anything specific that had woken me, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air was too warm, and the sounds of the neighborhood outside didn't seem right. I tossed and turned for a while, trying to fall back asleep, but it wasn't happening. I decided to get up and grab a drink of water from the kitchen. As I walked down the short hallway toward the kitchen, the silence of the apartment felt heavy, almost too still. I reached for the cabinet door, swung it open, and that's when I saw them. Hundreds of cockroaches. At first, I thought I was seeing things, or maybe I had missed a light switch or something. But no. As soon as the cabinet door fully opened, they started scuttling out from the cracks in the wood, moving quickly and in all directions. They weren't just in one spot, they were everywhere, crawling over the walls, the shelves, and yes, the silverware. There was no way this was a one-time occurrence. These roaches were thriving here. I froze, my hands still gripping the cabinet door, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of their tiny legs scrambling across the surfaces was enough to make me gag. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I didn't want to think about how long they had been there or how many were hidden in the cracks and crevices of the kitchen. I closed the cabinet door quietly and turned to the drawers. When I opened one of those, the same scene unfolded. More cockroaches. Not as many as in the cabinet, but enough to make my stomach turn. There were even a few on the kitchen counter, moving sluggishly, oblivious to my presence. I stepped back, panic setting in. I grabbed my phone from the counter and took several pictures, trying to document what I was seeing. I wasn't sure if it would do any good, but I needed to make sure I had proof. I filmed a short video too, showing the infestation. Every instinct told me to leave, but I didn't want to overreact. Maybe this was a fluke, right? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. These cockroaches weren't new to the place. They had made themselves at home. I went into the bedroom to wake up my partner, who was still sound asleep. "Hey, wake up!" I whispered urgently. I didn't want to freak him out, but I needed to tell him what I had found. He groggily opened his eyes, and I showed him the video. His expression quickly changed from confusion to shock as he processed what I was saying. We didn't talk for long. There was no point in staying here. We had to leave, and we had to leave now. I started packing our things quickly, throwing clothes into our bags and trying to stay calm. My mind raced through 1,000 thoughts. How did this even happen? How had the host allowed this to go unnoticed? I couldn't stop thinking about how unsanitary it was, how dangerous it was. I didn't want to imagine what kind of conditions we had been sleeping in all night. We left the apartment and drove straight to a nearby hotel. I didn't even care that it was late, that we were now losing a night of our vacation. I didn't care about anything but getting out of that place. The hotel was decent, and we managed to check in without much trouble. I could finally breathe a little easier once we were settled into a clean room, far away from the nightmare we had just left behind. As soon as we were checked in, I pulled out my phone and messaged the host. I told her exactly what had happened, explaining that we had left because of the roaches. I attached the photos and video as evidence. I asked for a refund for the nights we had booked, since we obviously couldn't stay there with the infestation. Her response was dismissive, to say the least. "It's Florida. There's always bugs," woman shrugging, she replied, as if this was an acceptable explanation. The tone of her message made my blood boil. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the serious health risk the infestation posed. Just a flippant shrug over a problem that should have never happened in the first place. I didn't back down. I responded, stating that this was completely unacceptable and that we wouldn't tolerate staying in an uninhabitable place. I asked for a full refund, and I emphasized that this situation was far beyond what anyone could reasonably expect from an Airbnb. A day passed, and I heard nothing back. No refund, no apology. I then contacted Airbnb customer support, sending them the same video and photos outlining what had happened. I expected them to take our side, especially since there was such clear evidence of the issue. To my surprise, they sided with the host. Their excuse? Because we hadn't contacted the host before leaving the apartment. They said there was nothing they could do. I was stunned. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I had provided solid proof of the infestation, yet they still defended the host. I couldn't help but feel betrayed. I thought Airbnb was supposed to stand behind its guests, but it was clear they cared more about protecting their superhosts than doing what was right. I was especially annoyed when I checked the host's profile again and saw that they were a superhost with over 30 properties listed. It was becoming clear that Airbnb was more interested in their big clients than in protecting people like me, who had trusted them for a comfortable stay. I didn't give up. I left a scathing review on the listing, detailing the infestation and the unprofessionalism of the host. Within an hour, the profile for that specific property was taken down. I was furious. They had wiped it clean, hoping to remove any trace of our complaint. But it didn't end there. When I checked again, they had reinstated an older version of the listing so that my review wouldn't show up. It was manipulative, underhanded, and completely against Airbnb's rules. I didn't just sit back and let it go. I reported them to Airbnb for violating their policies. I sent them screenshots explaining how the host had removed the listing to hide negative feedback. But even then, I never heard back from Airbnb. No follow-up, no apology, nothing. That was when it really hit me Airbnb didn't care. They didn't care about their guests, they didn't care about cleanliness, and they certainly didn't care about the safety or well-being of the people staying in their listings. All they cared about was keeping their superhosts happy, even if that meant overlooking serious issues like a massive cockroach infestation. In the end, I gave up on trying to get a refund or any sort of acknowledgement from either the host or Airbnb. I was angry, frustrated, and disappointed. I learned my lesson the hard way. The shiny reviews and ratings don't always tell the truth. And when something goes wrong, don't expect Airbnb to have your back. We left Florida early, and the rest of our vacation was nothing like we had imagined. Instead of relaxing on the beach, we were dealing with the aftermath of a nightmare stay in an Airbnb. The trip ended up feeling like a waste of time and money, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being taken advantage of. Now, whenever someone asks about booking an Airbnb, I always hesitate. I tell them about what happened and how even when things went horribly wrong, I couldn't get any help. It wasn't just about the roaches. It was about how Airbnb failed to stand by its guests. That's the part that still bothers me the most. The worst part is knowing that other people might have had the same experience and didn't get any help either. So, if you're thinking about booking an Airbnb, think twice. Read the reviews carefully, and remember that what you see online isn't always what you get. Don't make the mistake I did. And if something goes wrong, don't expect the company to back you up. They likely won't. Last week, my husband and I embarked on our first trip since the onset of the pandemic. It was a special occasion, marking my birthday, our long overdue honeymoon, and a house hunting expedition all rolled into one. We were filled with anticipation and joy as we planned our week-long stay in Oregon. After thorough research, we found an Airbnb that seemed to fit our needs perfectly. The booking process was seamless, and we were eager to begin our adventure. Upon arrival, the property exceeded our expectations. Nestled in a serene neighborhood, the house was charming and well-maintained. The interior was cozy, with tasteful decor that made us feel right at home. The kitchen was well-equipped, allowing us to prepare our meals, and the living room offered a comfortable space to relax after our daily excursions. The bedroom was inviting, with a plush bed that promised restful nights. For the first couple of days, everything was idyllic. We explored the local area, enjoyed nature hikes, and celebrated my birthday with a quiet dinner. The listing mentioned that the property had 3 hosts, but we were informed that 2 were away during our stay. This arrangement suited us fine, as we valued our privacy. On the 3rd day, we met the remaining host, a man in his late 30s, who introduced himself warmly. He seemed friendly and approachable, and we exchanged pleasantries. During our conversation, he casually mentioned that he planned to host a party that evening. This revelation took us by surprise, as there had been no prior mention of such an event, either during the booking process or afterward. We had booked the property a month in advance, and such an oversight felt inconsiderate. Had we been informed earlier, we might have reconsidered our choice, preferring a more tranquil setting. However, caught off guard and not wanting to disrupt our plans, we decided to remain optimistic. We hoped it would be a small, intimate gathering that wouldn't intrude upon our peace. The host provided his phone number, suggesting we text him if the party became bothersome. While this gesture seemed considerate, it struck us as odd. Typically, any issues would be communicated through the Airbnb platform to ensure proper documentation and accountability. Nevertheless, we accepted his offer, trusting that the situation would be manageable. That evening, the party commenced around 6 p.m. Initially, the noise was minimal and we attempted to go about our evening routine. However, as the hours passed, the gathering grew louder and more boisterous. By 9 p.m., the noise had escalated significantly, with music blaring and animated conversations echoing through the walls. According to the house rules outlined in the Airbnb listing, parties were prohibited, and quiet hours were to be observed after 9 p.m. It became evident that the host was blatantly violating his own guidelines. We felt trapped in an uncomfortable situation. Confronting the host directly seemed daunting, especially since he was in the midst of entertaining his guests. Instead, we decided to document the disturbances. I recorded videos capturing the escalating noise levels and the influx of guests. These recordings would serve as evidence should we need to file a complaint later. As the night wore on, sleep became elusive. The party showed no signs of winding down, and the cacophony persisted into the early hours. At 2 a.m., exhausted and frustrated, we decided to reach out to Airbnb's customer support. We detailed the situation, emphasizing the breach of house rules and the impact on our stay. We also messaged the other 2 hosts through the Airbnb platform, hoping they were unaware of the events unfolding. An hour later, we received a response from one of the absent hosts. They expressed surprise and apologized for the inconvenience, stating they had no prior knowledge of the party. While the apology was appreciated, it did little to alleviate our immediate discomfort. The party finally subsided around 4 a.m., leaving us drained and disheartened. The following morning, we awoke feeling groggy and unrest. Our plans for the day included an extensive hike, but our depleted energy levels forced us to reconsider. Instead, we spent the day recuperating, napping intermittently to make up for the lost sleep. This disruption not only affected our schedule but also cast a shadow over what was meant to be a celebratory trip. Determined to seek redress, we formally requested a refund for that night stay through Airbnb's Resolution Center. We provided detailed accounts of the incident, accompanied by the video evidence we had gathered. According to Airbnb's policies, guests are encouraged to report issues within 72 hours of their occurrence to be eligible for refunds. We adhered to this guideline, hoping for a swift resolution. Days passed without a response from either Airbnb or the hosts. The lack of communication added to our frustration. We were also perturbed by Airbnb's review system, which allows hosts to review guests. But the reviews remain hidden until both parties have submitted their feedback or until the review period ends. This setup felt imbalanced, as we were eager to see if the host would acknowledge their misconduct publicly. In the interim, we sought advice from online forums and communities. Many users recommended persistently following up with Airbnb's customer support and escalating the issue if necessary. Some suggested utilizing social media platforms to highlight our grievances, as companies often respond promptly to public complaints to maintain their reputation. Taking this advice to heart, we continued to reach out to Airbnb, reiterating our concerns and the evidence supporting our claim. We emphasized the breach of trust and the negative impact on our experience. After several attempts, we finally received a response from Airbnb. They acknowledged the violation of house rules and expressed regret for the inconvenience caused. They agreed to issue a refund for the disrupted night and assured us that the matter would be addressed with the host to prevent future occurrences. While the refund provided some solace, the experience left a lasting impression. It underscored the importance of clear communication and the need for hosts to adhere to their own guidelines. For future travels, we resolved to be more vigilant, thoroughly reviewing host profiles and previous guest reviews to identify any potential red flags. We also decided to prioritize properties with a history of positive feedback and transparent communication. Our trip, though marred by this incident, taught us valuable lessons about advocacy and the importance of standing up for one's rights as a consumer. We hope that by sharing our experience, others might be better prepared to handle similar situations and ensure their travels are as enjoyable and stress-free as possible.